subcommittee will come to order. This subcommittee is meeting today to consider H.R. 476, Housing Fairness Act of 2009. The chair strongly encourages members to submit opening statements for the record, and without objection, all members may do so. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for a few brief opening remarks. I would like to thank the ranking member and the other members of the Subcommittee on Housing and Community Opportunity for joining me today for the markup of H.R. 476, the Housing Fairness Act of 2009. In January of this year, we held a hearing on Congressman Al Green's very important legislation to enhance efforts to combat housing discrimination. During that hearing, we heard from witnesses about discrimination faced by minorities, persons with disabilities, families with children, and others when searching for housing. These witnesses testified that more testing is needed to better prevent housing discrimination. Despite our progress in achieving greater civil rights over the past 40 years, the trend of depriving certain groups of people housing opportunities continues today. According to a Department of Housing and Urban Development report released last year, more Americans are reporting incidents of housing discrimination than ever before, with disability and race as the leading reasons for filing a complaint. Despite the growing number of reported fair housing violations, as a much greater number of violations go unreported. The National Fair Housing Alliance estimates that approximately 4 million fair housing violations occur each year, yet less than 31,000 fair housing complaints were actually filed in 2008, which was the highest total number of complaints ever filed in history. Furthermore, of those housing violations that were reported, private nonprofit fair housing groups processed approximately 20,000 complaints, which was 66% of the total complaint load. Meanwhile, HUD processed a mere 2,100 complaints, state and local agencies processed 8,429, and the Department of Justice filed 33 fair housing cases. It is clear that federal agencies have either been unable or unwilling to effectively identify and address the issue of housing discrimination. Little is being done to ensure fair and equal access to housing among minority populations. We know that high rates of racial steering continues to impact minorities. The Federal Fair Housing Initiatives Program was established to provide grants to fair housing centers to enforce fair housing laws and educate consumers. However, FHIP has never been fully funded. Thus, it is no wonder that so many fair housing violations are allowed to occur each year. That is why Mr. Green's bill is so crucial. H.R. 476 would authorize $20 million annually for HUD to administer a nationwide testing program to measure housing discrimination, reauthorize the FHIP program for 5 years, and require HUD to implement a competitive matching grant program for nonprofits to study the causes and effects of housing discrimination. The benefits of H.R. 476 would be tremendous in preventing millions of fair housing violations from taking place in our neediest communities. In closing, I encourage my colleagues to support this very important legislation, and I look forward to its passing out of the subcommittee today. I would now like to recognize our subcommittee's ranking member to make an opening statement, and standing in today is Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I wanted to thank you and the sponsor of this bill, Congressman Green, for your hard work and dedication on legislation to address fair housing and discrimination. Housing discrimination must not be tolerated, and we must do all we can to ensure fair housing and equal opportunity for all. I also want to thank Congressman Green for his willingness to engage in discussions with members on this side of the aisle and to include several important improvements to H.R. 476, the Housing Fairness Act of 2009. Specifically, we are grateful to Congressman Green for agreeing to include some of our suggestions in the manager's amendment. We intend to support the manager's amendment because it makes H.R. 476 a better bill. For example, it includes provisions that require HUD to issue regulations outlining the standards and procedures for the nationwide testing program, and accountability and oversight standards governing how funds are spent by qualified fair housing enforcement organizations. In addition, we appreciate your willingness to include language that would prohibit recipients from engaging in political activities. Madam Chair, we support the goal of ending housing discrimination and agree with Congressman Green that testing is an important tool in that fight. However, with the ever-increasing deficit, and it's now, as we know yesterday, passing $13 trillion, we continue to be concerned that this bill creates two new programs and authorizes $100 million in new spending with no offsets or indication of the source of funding. In this economy with record deficits, we simply cannot justify the commitments of these funds to our constituents in the absence of determining whether it will lead to better enforcement or fair housing and a significant reduction, or better yet, an end to housing discrimination altogether. Currently, the U.S. Department of Justice administers a fair housing testing program within its Housing and Civil Enforcement section. The primary focus of DOJ's fair housing testing program is to identify unlawful housing discrimination based on race, national origin, disability, or family status. Rather than spending new funds creating a new nationwide testing program through HUD, perhaps a more economical approach would be to have the Department of Justice work in consultation with HUD to conduct housing discrimination testing. While I understand that the DOJ testing program may have a different focus from the national testing program envisioned in H.R. 476, it may make sense to accommodate the goals of the national testing program into the DOJ program. With that in mind, I hope we can continue to work together on this legislation as it moves forward to consideration at the full committee. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Are there requests for opening statements from any of the other members? Mr. Green, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if there's one thing that I'd like to do today, it is to make sure that those who are within the sound of my voice and viewing understand that these thank yous are sincere. Too often you hear thank yous and you sometimes get to the point where you believe that they are perfunctory. This is really a day for being grateful for what others have done to help us get to this point. So, Madam Chair, I want to thank you very much. You have been not only a good advisor, you have been a real friend in helping me with this legislation. I'd like to thank Chairman Frank. He is not here, but he too has been a friend and an advisor. Ms. Capito and I have had multiple meetings. We have had good conversations. I never discuss what the conversations entail because these are member conversations, but I want people to know that we have had good conversations. I've also met with Ms. Biggert, and we've had a good conversation and good discussions. Mr. Lee and I had an opportunity to visit this morning, and the visit was a good one, and I'm honored that he is here today and has indicated that the manager's amendment will be supported. Having thanked all of these persons, I must say, you really don't do good things without good staff. The staff members really make the difference because they are on the front line. They are the persons who meet for long hours and negotiate. They are the persons who deal with the nuances, and they get an understanding and a clarity that is exceedingly important, and they share this with the member. So I'm grateful to the staff of Ms. Capito. I'm grateful to the staff, the committee staff, for what they have done. To my staff, I'd like to call names, but if I call names, I'll miss someone. So I'm going to continue to say staff, but I want the staff to know that it means a lot to this member to have you work the tireless hours that you worked so that we could get this bill to this point. I also want to thank many organizations that were helpful. I cannot name all of them, and I probably shouldn't name any, and maybe I won't right now. But the point is, we receive help from industry. We receive help from consumer organizations. And one that has stayed with me quite a bit has, of course, been the National Alliance for Fair Housing, and appreciative of what they've done. So this part of this hearing for me has been an opportunity to show people that I'm grateful, that I'm thankful, and hopeful that we will continue to move this legislation, and I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. If there are no further statements, the committee will proceed to consider the subcommittee's agenda. The subcommittee will now consider H.R. 476, Housing Fairness Act of 2009. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 476 to authorize funds to prevent housing discrimination through the use of nationwide testing to increase funds.
Without objection, H.R. 476 shall be considered as read. Open for amendment at any point in base text for the purposes of amendment. Are there amendments to the bill?
I have an amendment at the desk, Madam Chair. It is a manager's amendment.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 476 offered by Mr. Al Green of Texas. Page 1, line 4s and 5, strike.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The genesis of the bill, and hence the amendment as well, goes back to 1966, when Senators Brooke and Mondale were working on a piece of legislation that has become known as the Fair Housing Act of 1968. They were not successful in the early years in trying to get this legislation through. On April 4th of 1968, Dr. King had an untimely demise. About 7 days later, this bill was signed, and it was signed because of the efforts of Dr. King to bring fair housing and justice in housing to all Americans. This bill outlawed discrimination in housing based upon race, color, religion, and national origin. In 1974, sex was added to the list. 1988, handicapped persons were added to the list. And now, today, H.R. 476, with the manager's amendment, is going to add a focus on veterans and military personnel. The obvious question has to be, why veterans and military personnel, among all of the other classes, as well as the fact that we are focusing on women and families with children? Here's why. Because a 2008 study by the National Fair Housing Alliance has indicated that 31% to 49%, nearly 50% of 3,758 complaints were based upon disability. And per USA Today, 2008, 2.9 million of the persons who are disabled are veterans. And what I'd like to do is just read from this, because this article speaks volumes and it won't take long. Troops come home with devastating injuries that might well have killed them in earlier wars. The number of disabled veterans has jumped by 25% since 2001 to 2.9 million, underscore, 2.9 million. And the cause is really no mystery. This is the cost of war. And it goes on to explain that this has happened since 9/11. The point that I'd like to make is, with this bill, we will have an opportunity to deal with the discrimination that exists against the disabled. Many of these persons are veterans. Too many are veterans. Someone will always ask, how many is too many? And in my world, one is too many when it comes to people who will travel to distant places, risk their lives so that we can have a better way of life, and return home and find that they cannot receive housing. This bill allows for testing. Testing is the most acceptable means by which you can acquire empirical evidence to substantiate the fact that discrimination exists. This bill will allow for testing not only in rental, not only in the purchase of a home, but it also allows for testing with some of these scam artists. Things have evolved immensely, and we have scam artists who hold themselves out as persons who can help you get your mortgage reformed, and they charge a fee, and many of the fees that they charge are imposed upon disabled people who happen to be veterans. And they take this fee, and the veteran, the disabled person, the person who is being discriminated against will literally get nothing. We also have circumstances wherein veterans will need animals. They're called service animals, not pets. And they need them in their homes with them so that they can have the benefit of vision that an animal might provide that a veteran may not have. There is discrimination against persons with service animals who are disabled. We also find that the families of veterans are seeking housing, and too often there are places that don't accept children. Children are obviously people who need housing. So this bill covers a lot of the circumstances that go under the radar that we really don't like to talk about. But the bill also does something else. It does not appropriate one dime. It authorizes, it does not appropriate one dime. Appropriators will ultimately deal with the amount that this bill will carry by way of what is commonly called cost here. But it doesn't appropriate any money. I will yield back, Madam Chair, and look forward to answering questions.
Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr. Green. Are there members wishing to
Madam
speak on
Chair.
this amendment?
May I?
Mr. Lee?
I'm sorry. Okay.
You good? Okay. Then, gentleman from Missouri, go right ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to engage in a colloquy with my colleague from Texas, if he would.
Sure.
The area that covers testers, does the legislation allow for testers to be outside of government, in other words, to allow for people who work for not-for-profits to be testers? Is that how that provision would work?
It does, but it also sets a standard for testers such that HUD will promulgate the standard, and that standard also carries with it evaluation process. So yes, it does allow for it, but we have moved forward because at the committee level, when we heard testimony, we found that there were many persons concerned about the quality of testing.
And the testing has proven to be effective?
Testing has not only proven to be effective, it has proven to be the most effective methodology by which you can acquire the empirical evidence that we seek. A lot of other evidence is good. If you have a person to confess, obviously that's the best evidence. But testing allows you to send persons in, all of whom are qualified for a given rental property, by way of example, and find out if the property is available to all of these persons. If we send a disabled person in and two persons that are not, and the two persons that are not are acceptable to the person that's renting the property, and the disabled person is not, that gives us some evidence. That's not the sole evidence. Additional evidence is used as well, but testing is most effective.
And it sounds like it's pretty effective when it comes to, I guess, catching predators who come up with these get-rich-quick schemes and really strip out the equity out of people's homes when they refinance.
And we have seen a lot of it. The answer is yes, and we've seen a lot of it. As you know, the subprime crisis was caused in part by persons who were pushing persons into subprime loans who actually qualified for prime loans. Many of these persons were persons who were in the protected classes that the Housing Fairness Act covers, but also many of these persons were veterans because they were disabled and they were part of the classes that were protected. The statistical information that I called to your attention earlier, I'll reiterate quickly. Persons with disabilities appear to be the most discriminated against in our country, about 37.3% of the persons. And then you go to familial status, which is 15.1%. Race is still a factor. But we would make a mistake if we continue this focus on race and let race drive this kind of legislation. It is important. I do not deny the fact that racial discrimination exists. But the point that we want to focus on is the fact that there is a hidden secret that has to be revealed, and it is that veterans are being discriminated against too, because we have a good many people who are disabled who are veterans, and a good many more who will be returning from Iraq, from Afghanistan, who will have physical disabilities as well as mental disabilities, and they're going to need housing. This bill is going to help protect them from invidious discrimination.
I thank the gentleman for his responses, and I fully support this legislation. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other discussion? If not, I recognize myself for a few minutes for a brief statement in support of Mr. Green's manager's amendment. First of all, I'd like to commend the great work of Mr. Green in working diligently to produce a strongly supported bipartisan manager's amendment. Mr. Green and Ms. Capito came together to ensure that the manager's amendment would include the request of both sides of the aisle while still retaining the essence of this very important legislation. The manager's amendment includes several changes that will improve Mr. Green's legislation to end housing discrimination. It will provide greater oversight for the FHIP program and authorizes the Secretary of HUD to establish minimum quality standards for testing enforcement programs, as well as strengthens the qualification requirements of testers. Furthermore, Mr. Green's amendment will also expand the scope of the research provision to include veterans and military personnel who have also been targeted for housing discrimination. Lastly, the manager's amendment accommodates the request to reduce the authorization levels originally requested in Mr. Green's bill. It would reduce the authorization level for the FHIP program by nearly $10 million a year and limits the program to 5 years. It also reduces the authorization level for the nationwide testing program by $5 million a year for 5 years and requires an increase in the local matching grant from 25 to 50%. These concessions represent the commitment by both sides of the aisle of the subcommittee to pass critical legislation that will help bring an end to housing discrimination. I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time. If there is no further discussion, without objection, the previous question is ordered, and the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? If not, without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question now occurs on approving the bill as amended and forwarding it to the full committee with a favorable recommendation. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to and forwarded to the full committee with a favorable recommendation. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes in the measure approved by the subcommittee today. And if there is no further business to come before the subcommittee, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you very much.